Greater Tund Island, positioned in the narrow and strategically critical Strait of Hormuz, appeared at first glance to be nothing more than a barren stretch of rock rising out of the shimmering blue waters of the Gulf. From the air, it looked lifeless, scorched by the sun and shaped by years of relentless wind and salt. There were no visible buildings, no roads, and no signs of human presence, just steep cliffs, jagged stone, and empty shoreline. To passing ships and distant observers, the island seemed insignificant, easily overlooked in one of the busiest and most heavily monitored waterways in the world. Yet beneath its eastern cliffs, carved deep into the rock and reinforced with layers of steel and concrete, lay a secret that had quietly reshaped the balance of intelligence in the region. For 6 months, the United States had operated a covert underground facility there, hidden from satellites, shielded from radar, and designed to listen to every whisper of Iranian military activity across the Gulf. This underground bunker was not just a listening post. It was a nerve center. Advanced antenna arrays were embedded into the cliffs, disguised as natural rock formations. Fiber optic cables ran deep into the mountain, connecting encrypted systems to satellites in orbit and command centers thousands of miles away. Inside the facility, rows of glowing monitors tracked Iranian naval patrols, missile deployments, radar sweeps, and encrypted radio transmissions in real time. Analysts could follow the movement of warships leaving port, monitor training exercises, and even detect changes in communication patterns that hinted at upcoming operations. Every signal, every transmission, and every electronic footprint was captured, sorted, and relayed to U.S. Central Command. In a region where minutes could determine the outcome of a crisis, this hidden facility provided a powerful advantage. Guarding this intelligence stronghold were 15 members of the U.S. Marine Corps' Force Reconnaissance Unit, a group selected not for numbers but for capability. These Marines were not conventional infantry. Each one had undergone years of advanced training in reconnaissance, counterintelligence, survival, and special operations. They were experts in operating behind enemy lines, trained to move unseen, fight outnumbered, and endure extreme conditions. Their role on the island went far beyond standing watch. They maintained the defensive systems, conducted patrols along the cliffs and shoreline, and rehearsed emergency scenarios almost daily. Every Marine knew the mission by heart. If the facility was discovered, they were to hold it for as long as humanly possible, no matter the cost, until reinforcements could arrive. Life on the island was tense and isolated. The Marines lived in a sealed section of the bunker, rotating between watch shifts, maintenance duties, and training drills. The sun never truly set on their sense of readiness. Even during moments of rest, weapons were within arm's reach, and alarms were tested regularly. They knew where they were, deep inside territory claimed by Iran, in waters patrolled by Revolutionary Guard naval forces. Any mistake, any signal leak, or any unexpected transmission could expose their presence. For months, they remained invisible, their facility undetected, their mission uninterrupted. That invisibility ended with a single intercepted signal. Iranian intelligence units, monitoring military frequencies across the Gulf, picked up encrypted transmissions that did not match any known regional patterns. The encryption was advanced, unmistakably American. Analysts traced the signal's origin and narrowed it down to Greater Tund Island. The discovery sent shockwaves through Tehran's command structure. The idea that the United States had established a hidden military intelligence facility on what Iran considered its sovereign territory was not just a provocation. It was a direct challenge. Within minutes, the situation escalated from an intelligence concern to a national security crisis. Senior commanders were alerted, and reports moved rapidly up the chain of command. The conclusion was unanimous. The American presence had to be eliminated. Allowing such a facility to operate unchallenged would undermine Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz and expose its military operations to constant surveillance. Orders were issued to the Revolutionary Guard Naval Command with absolute clarity. Locate the Americans, capture them if possible, and destroy everything inside the facility. From Iran's perspective, the plan seemed straightforward. Intelligence suggested that only a small American detachment was present on the island. 15 Marines isolated, cut off, and surrounded by Iranian-controlled waters. Against them, Iran could deploy hundreds of elite commandos, fast attack boats, and heavy weapons. The math appeared simple. Overwhelming force would ensure a quick victory, a decisive message to the United States, and a powerful display of Iranian control over the region. What Tehran did not fully understand was the nature of the force it was about to confront. Those 15 Marines were not simply guards. They were a defensive spearhead, trained to turn terrain into a weapon and time into an ally. The facility they protected was not just hidden. It was hardened, armed, and integrated into a global military network capable of responding in minutes. As Iranian boats prepared to launch and commanders finalized their assault plans, the Marines beneath the cliffs of Greater Tund Island were already on alert, watching their screens, tracking distant radar blips, and preparing to defend their position against what they knew would soon be an overwhelming and violent storm. The first sign of a coming storm appeared not on the horizon, but on a glowing radar screen deep inside the underground facility. A cluster of fast-moving contacts emerged from the direction of the Iranian mainland, their speed and formation unmistakable. Gunnery Sergeant Jake Morrison and his team leaned over the displays as the system refined the picture. 24 surface vessels, moving in coordinated lines, supported by heavier silhouettes behind them. There was no mistaking what this meant. This was not a patrol, not a warning maneuver, and not a show of force. It was an assault. Within seconds, the quiet tension inside the bunker transformed to controlled urgency. Alarms were sounded throughout the facility, and the 15 Force Recon Marines moved to their assigned positions with practiced precision. Weapons were unlocked, ammunition distributed, and defensive systems brought online. Each Marine knew exactly where to go and what to do. Months of drills and rehearsals now became reality. The hidden fortress beneath the cliffs was coming alive. Outside, the Iranian task force cut across the water in a wide, intimidating formation. The lead boats were packed with Revolutionary Guard commandos, their dark uniforms and helmets silhouetted against the bright glare of the sun. Behind them, artillery support vessels and missile boats took up positions, their heavier weapons angled toward the island. The commanders aboard believed they were about to overwhelm a small and isolated enemy force. From their perspective, this was a demonstration of strength, a swift and decisive operation that would end before it truly began. As the boats closed the distance, the Marines activated the island's layered defenses. Along the cliffs, sections of rock shifted and slid aside, revealing hidden firing ports. Heavy machine guns mounted in reinforced positions were powered up and calibrated, their barrels tracking the incoming vessels. Remote control weapon systems rotated into place, covering key approach routes along the shoreline. Beneath the sand and stone near the beach, minefields lay waiting, carefully mapped and monitored from inside the bunker. Deeper inside the facility, anti-armor missile systems were armed and placed on standby, their targeting systems locked onto the largest and most threatening vessels in the formation. At just under 1,000 meters from shore, the Iranian commander opened an unsecured radio channel. His voice carried clearly over the airwaves, calm and authoritative, broadcasting in English, so there would be no misunderstanding. He announced that the Americans were operating on Iranian territory and demanded their immediate surrender. He promised that resistance would only lead to destruction. Inside the bunker, the Marines listened in silence. Morrison took the microphone and delivered a response that was short, firm, and unmistakable. There would be no surrender. There would be no retreat. The message was transmitted across every frequency the Iranian fleet was using. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. Moments later, the sea erupted in noise and fire. The first shots came from the Iranian boats. Machine guns rattled and rocket-propelled grenades streaked toward the cliffs, exploding in flashes of smoke and debris. Artillery shells from support vessels slammed into the rocky shoreline, sending shards of stone flying into the air. The sound of bombardment rolled across the island like thunder, echoing off the cliffs and shaking the bunker's reinforced walls. Then the Marines answered. Hidden machine gun positions opened up in unison, their heavy rounds tearing across the water in long, precise streams. The thin hulls of the fast attack boats were no match for the firepower unleashed from the cliffs. Water erupted into towering plumes as bullets ripped through the surface around the advancing vessels. Some boats swerved sharply, trying to evade the deadly arcs of fire, while others pressed forward, determined to reach the shore. From inside the facility, Missile operators locked onto priority targets. With a sharp command, anti-armor missiles launched from concealed ports in the rock. The weapons streaked low over the water before slamming into their targets with devastating force. One of the lead boats vanished in a fireball, reduced to burning fragments. Another was thrown sideways by the blast, its crew scrambling as flames spread across the deck. Despite the losses, Iranian troops continued their advance. Several boats managed to reach the beach, their rams dropping as commandos poured onto the sand. The fight instantly shifted from long-range engagement to brutal close-quarters combat. Marines emerged from reinforced fighting positions along the cliffs and shoreline, engaging the attackers with rifles and grenades. Smoke filled the air, and the sharp cracks of gunfire echoed between the rocks. The beach became a chaotic battleground. Iranian troops attempted to establish footholds, using the wreckage of their own boats as cover. The Marines countered with disciplined, coordinated fire, moving between positions, covering one another, and pushing back every advance. The sound of explosions, shouted commands, and clashing weapons blended into a constant, deafening roar. For the Iranian commandos, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This was not a lightly defended outpost. It was a fortified stronghold, manned by highly trained defenders who seemed to be everywhere at once. Every step forward was met with overwhelming resistance. Every attempt to regroup was disrupted by precise and relentless fire. Inside the bunker, Morrison monitored the battle through camera feeds and sensor displays, directing his Marines with calm, steady commands. He knew they were buying time. Time for reinforcements, time for air support, time for the full weight of the U.S. military to arrive. Outside, under the blazing sun, and amid the smoke and chaos, the 15 Marines held their ground, turning the narrow strip of shoreline into a barrier that refused to break. What the Iranian task force had expected to be a swift and decisive operation had become a grinding, violent struggle. The island, which had seemed so small and insignificant from a distance, now felt like a trap. And as the battle raged on, the distant thunder of approaching aircraft began to hint that something far more powerful was about to enter the fight. The turning point came not from the ground, but from the sky. Above the smoke-choked shoreline and the chaos of gunfire, a distant, rising roar cut through the battle, a sound so deep and powerful that even the Iranian commandos instinctively looked up. Within seconds, four dark shapes tore across the bright blue sky at blinding speed. U.S. stealth fighter jets had arrived. The pilots saw the situation instantly. Below them, the narrow beaches of Greater Tund Island were littered with burning wreckage, shattered boats, and clusters of Iranian troops pressing forward under fire. The 15 Marines were still holding their positions, but the attackers were coming in waves, and the margin for error was shrinking. Over secure channels, the pilots received their orders. Hostile vessels and enemy concentrations were now authorized targets. The jets banked sharply and descended. In a coordinated strike, precision-guided bombs dropped from their wings, streaking toward the water and shoreline below. The impacts were devastating. Enemy boats vanished in towering columns of flame and spray, their hulls ripped apart by the explosions. Shock waves rippled across the surface of the sea, flipping smaller craft and scattering debris across the beach. For the Iranian forces, the sudden appearance of overwhelming air power was a psychological blow as much as a physical one. The battlefield, which moments earlier had been a brutal contest of rifles and grenades, was now being reshaped by weapons that struck from beyond reach. The jets did not stop there. Circling back, they unleashed cannon fire in precise, controlled bursts, targeting enemy positions along the shoreline. The sand erupted in plumes of dust and smoke as the rounds tore through makeshift cover and shattered defensive lines. Iranian troops who had pushed forward were forced to dive for shelter, their momentum broken by the relentless pressure from above. Moments later, another sound joined the roar of the fighters, the deep, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors. From over the horizon came attack helicopters, flying low and fast, hugging the contours of the sea before rising sharply over the island. Their silhouettes loomed through the smoke like mechanical predators. As they reached firing range, the helicopters opened up. Missiles streaked from their pylons, slamming into artillery support vessels that had been pounding the shoreline. One by one, the heavier Iranian boats erupted in fire and sank into the water. Rocket pods followed, saturating enemy positions on the beach and along the rocky approaches. The combined effect of air strikes and helicopter fire was overwhelming. What had been a coordinated assault began to fracture into scattered pockets of resistance. For Marines on the ground, the arrival of air support felt like a surge of energy through their exhausted ranks. They pushed forward from their defensive positions, using the chaos created by the strikes to regain ground and tighten their hold on the shoreline. But the operation was not finished. The plan was no longer just to hold the island. It was to take control of the battlefield entirely. High above, transport aircraft approached in formation. Their engines roared as they slowed and descended, their silhouettes growing larger against the sky. These were not evacuation flights. They carried reinforcements. One by one, the aircraft tilted and dropped toward the island, kicking up clouds of sand and dust as they touched down in areas just beyond the main fighting. Their rear ramps lowered, and rows of U.S. Marines poured out at a run. Hundreds of fresh troops moved with disciplined speed, fanning out into tactical formations, weapons raised, securing landing zones and establishing firing lines. For the Iranian forces, the realization was devastating. What they had believed to be a small, isolated American detachment was now reinforced by a full combat element landing behind them. The battlefield had flipped in a matter of minutes. The attackers were becoming surrounded. The newly arrived Marines advanced methodically, cutting off routes back to beach and blocking paths toward the interior of the island. Machine guns were set up on elevated ground, mortars were positioned to cover open areas, and rifle teams moved through the rocks and wreckage, pushing the remaining Iranian troops into ever-shrinking pockets. Out at sea, the final piece of the trap closed. U.S. warships stationed offshore brought their weapons to bear. Precision naval gunfire began to target any Iranian boat still floating or attempting to approach. Shells struck the water with pinpoint accuracy, punching through hulls and sending vessels sinking beneath the waves. Some Iranian crews tried to turn back toward the mainland, but their escape routes were already under surveillance from the air. Fighter jets swooped in again, and missiles streaked across the sky toward the fleeing boats. Explosions flared on the horizon as the last avenues of retreat disappeared in smoke and fire. The sea itself had become a barrier, sealing the Iranian forces on the island. On the ground, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. Iranian commandos found themselves hemmed in from every direction. In front of them were the original 15 Marines, still holding their fortified positions. Behind them were hundreds of newly arrived U.S. troops, advancing with steady, coordinated pressure. Above them, aircraft and helicopters circled, weapons ready. Beyond the shoreline, naval guns and fighter jets controlled the water. The battle was no longer a contest. It was a collapse. Small groups of Iranian soldiers attempted to regroup, but every movement drew immediate response. A rush across open sand was met with machine gun fire. A cluster forming behind wreckage was broken up by a rocket strike. Communication between units faltered as commanders struggled to understand how the situation had turned so quickly. For the Marines, the operation became a careful, deliberate sweep. They moved forward in coordinated lines, calling out positions, securing prisoners, and clearing remaining resistance. The combination of air, land, and sea power had created an overwhelming advantage that left no room for maneuver. What had begun as an assault by a superior force had ended in a perfect example of modern, integrated warfare. In less than an hour, the battlefield had been transformed by speed, coordination, and technological dominance. The Iranian task force, once confident in advancing, now stood trapped on a narrow strip of rock, facing an enemy that controlled the sky, the sea, and the ground beneath their feet. And as the smoke slowly drifted across the island and the echoes of explosions faded, it became clear that the outcome was no longer in doubt. The only question that remained was how and when the fight would finally